answers.
Can you click got it?
Oh, we, what?
Can you click got it?
Oh, got it, yeah. No, where's the cursor? The cursor just, oh, it appears and disappears. Oh, there it is, okay, got it. Okay, are we set now? Are we officially on?
You're all set.
Okay, so I'm gonna just introduce myself very briefly. My name is Robert Bunkin. For people who are on Zoom, I just want you to know we do have a live audience here, so you may not hear their questions at some point when I do take questions. I will try to summarize the questions so that you can understand what I'm talking about, because apparently last time we did this, not everybody understood that. Anyway, welcome. My name is Robert Bunkin, and first I identify myself as an artist. So I'm a painter, but I've also been a museum curator, and I've taught art history for many years. And I call this series of talks Art Talks because it really isn't a formal art history lesson or classroom. And really I select topics that are of interest to me personally that I feel motivated to share with other people. And oftentimes I pick topics that are a little less explored than what's usually explored in art history talks. So today I thought it would be great to start the series with a talk on humor in art. And I realized from the first, I said to myself, you know, and everybody knows this, when you explain a joke, it's not funny anymore. So a lot of what I'm going to be doing tonight is explaining jokes. But I hope when you respond to the images that I show you, you'll think about them first and respond to them, you know, directly. So I do have a dedication that I would like to offer this evening because a very dear friend of mine, Chan Graham, he was known as Chan, but his full name was Channel Graham, who is an architect, a graphic designer, and a very dear friend, recently passed away last week. And I like to share this photograph of him. He moved back to Albuquerque, where he had his architectural practice. Yeah. Whoops. Oh, sorry. See, already we're having trouble. You know, so I wanted to share his very sweet face and just remember him. So that has absolutely nothing to do with humor and art, but he had a great sense of humor too. Okay, so the first image I present here is the oldest image. And basically I've organized the presentation chronologically. So we're going to come closer and closer and to contemporary times. This is quite ancient. It's from the Ramessid period. That's actually the period that the Old Testament deals with when the Hebrews were in captivity in Egypt. And this is a papyrus. So it's an ancient papyrus scroll. These were generally kept. Some of them were found in tombs. I guess most of them were found in tombs. And papyrus is a predecessor to paper. So it was made from papyrus reeds, which was a plant that grew along the Nile. And it was prepared. I don't know technically how exactly they made papyrus, but some of them have survived. This is a very famous one in the British Museum. And it's a satirical papyrus. So what it does is one of the tropes of humor that we still have to this day, which is putting animals in human situations, like anthropomorphizing animals. So you could almost read it like a comic strip. You see a gazelle playing a board game, which was called Senate, with a lion. Now, what do you know in nature about gazelles and lions? They're predators, right? I mean, the lion is a predator of gazelle. So normally they would not, I mean, obviously they never play a board game anyway, but they'd never be peaceably sitting around the table ever. So that's another comical trope that you often will see in comedy, things we expect that are sort of turned around, like the world turned upside down, right? And this sort of continues throughout this fragment of the papyrus scroll, because if you look to the next segment, you see a jackal who's herding antelope. And again, the jackal is a pack animal who would prey on antelope. So here he's not only peaceably playing the role of a kind of shepherd, but he's playing a double panpipe, a flute. So he's like merrily playing this music along as he's shepherding these animals, which would normally be his prey. Then there's another jackal in the front of the group. And then there's a cat who seems to be herding geese, and he's even got a little gosling in his paw. Again, geese, birds, and cats generally don't get along like this. So that's another situation where things are kind of inverted. And then finally, we see that lion again with the gazelle lying on a table. And this is a little bit of bawdy humor. So now we have the lion, who is obviously a male, who's about to have intercourse with his the opponent in the game of Senate, who's obviously a female. At least we think it's a female in this case. Anyway, so, these kind of games, anthropomorphizing animals, which is, like I said, a trope of humor. So now moving ahead in time, we're coming to Greece and Rome. And the Greeks and the Romans both definitely had a sense of humor. There are comic plays that have survived, and those were called satyr plays. So those were named after the satyr, who was like half goat, half human. And a characteristic of satyrs and all those sort of like centaurs, all those half human, half animal type of creatures, was that they could not control their animal instincts, their lustfulness, and so forth. So these are like animals that sort of symbolize, for the Greeks in particular, this idea of a lack of moderation. And the Greeks had a lot of ideas about moderating behavior. Like in the symposium, which were these drinking parties, you weren't supposed to drink to excess, but we know that they probably did, because we also know that the Greeks would invite heterae, which were prostitutes, and male prostitutes, and also sometimes servants, to serve the sexual appetites of the guests, were exclusively male. And there were also images of symposia where the guests themselves, the men, are flirting with each other, glancing lustfully at other men. And, there was a kind of an etiquette of how men were supposed to behave with other men, including etiquette for how male lovers were supposed to behave. Like usually, if you look at Greek pottery, you'll see images of homosexual lovers, where the older man was always represented with a beard and the younger man was always beardless. So that way you knew, okay, this is a young man who is like the more passive partner, and the older man who was the more aggressive partner. And those were not supposed to ever reverse. That was part of the etiquette, of these things. So I'm not showing you those kind of images, but I am showing you the middle image, which is a comedy scene, which was found in a villa in Pompeii. And we know that that was a copy from a destroyed Greek fresco. So this is a mosaic copy of a famous Greek fresco, which showed a theatrical scene, and it's a scene from comedy. And we also know it's comedy, which is called a satyr play, because of the musical instruments and the kinds of masks that the performers are wearing. So we don't know what the comedy was, but we know that it was meant to, it would be understood as a comical scene. Then the dancing figure, possibly from Alexandria, which by that time was a Greek colony, is showing an entertainer. So these would be like professional entertainers. They would usually be very scantily clad. His features, if you notice, a very prominent nose and a shaved head with a little like a ponytail, that indicates that he was not a Greek. So he'd be a foreigner, a kind of exotic type. And his very thin waist shows that he was possibly a contortionist, sort of like an exotic dancer that would entertain at a party, or possibly even at an elaborate symposium. And the other image on our right is a statuette of a satyr who's abducting a Maenad. So again, this, when we think of abduction for obviously sexual purposes, we think, oh, that's terrible, he's going to rape her. But in the Greek mind, these were playful images that were bawdy, that were sexual. And the satyr, like the faun or the centaur, was always this kind of lustful creature. And he's this kind of, chubby guy. And I think his expression is wonderful, the gleeful expression on his face. This is a tiny little clay statuette that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. And these usually were small scale sculptures that were mass produced. The more expensive ones were cast in bronze, like the dancing figure, and the cheaper ones were mass produced and cast in hollow clay and available, widely available. So many of them have survived. And now we're jumping to late medieval, early Renaissance Europe, and we're all familiar with the image of the jester. So again, to some extent, contemporary ideas have changed what we find funny. Making faces is still funny. If you look at a lot of comedy, and just like playing with children, one way to get on the good side of a kid is like play peekaboo, make faces at them, and kids always love that. And I think even as adults, we like that. But in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, courts had resident jesters who were like human pets. They may have had a salary. In fact, we know that some of the jesters that were in the Spanish court were rather well paid, well dressed, and well taken care of, very well fed. But some of them were, what we would today call developmentally delayed, like mentally delayed people who had deformities, quirks, dwarfs, people with very obvious, like hunchbacks and things like that, were all sort of stock characters as court jesters. So the guy in the painting by Marx Reichlich, a Tyrolean painter, obviously was one of those people. He has crossed eyes. He's shown eating a soft-boiled egg, dripping down his chin, dripping down his hands, like he can't really control his appetite and his eating habits. He's got a cute little puppy on his shoulder. He's carrying a scepter, which has the head of a jester on it. And also, if you look at his hat, you see little bells that dangle from the corners. So he made noise as he walked. He would jingle. And very often he also had jingles on his staff. So when he walked around, he made noise. And basically, it was a kind of slapstick humor. It was a very broad slapstick humor. And some jesters were very witty and clever and were allowed to get away with jokes where they would make fun of the head of the court, where nobody else would get away with that. So they introduced a kind of levity. Another thing about jesters, which you probably all know, is that generally they wore very particular clothing that was party colored, like very colorful, mismatched. And you see that in both cases. The earlier painting by Jean Fouquet is of a jester that we actually can identify by name. We don't know who the jester was that Marx Reichlich painted, but in the Fouquet painting, we know that this was an Italian jester in the court of Ferrara in northern Italy. And we know that Fouquet actually traveled in Italy and brought back a lot of new ideas from the Italian Renaissance to France. So he was one of the first artists in France, for example, to introduce Brunelleschian perspective in his illuminated manuscript paintings. And you see classical references in some of his paintings from architecture and stuff like that. So he really sort of introduced Renaissance ideas to medieval France, and he was a pioneer in that respect. Yeah.
These aren't very big, right?
No, the dimensions are there. Some of them are in inches and some of them are in centimeters, but they're rather small, usually oil on panel paintings. So they're a little less than life size usually.
And is he wearing a point or is it medal or something?
Yeah, he's wearing a medallion, and I haven't been able to identify the medallion, but my hunch is that it may be a medallion that relates to the court that he worked in. We do know that he would have been working around the area of, like, what's today very North Italy, where they still speak German, and, you know, into Austria, in the area of the Alps, Tyrol. I'm hearing a voice.
I think that
Yeah.
that thing that looks like a medallion is actually a button, because there's another one underneath it in shadow.
Yeah, but it has a portrait, profile portrait on it. So it's more significant than just a button.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so this is around contemporary of Marx Reichlich. This is an artist who often did very satirical paintings. Again, usually worked in oil on oak panel, as most Northern artists of the early Renaissance did. And this is usually Ramesvale would represent people dealing with money. So money lenders or tax collectors. In this case, the title that's on the painting from the National Gallery in London is the tax gatherers or tax collectors. So the younger man has this really grotesque expression on his face. They're wearing these really weird ruffled hats that Ramesvale loved to paint. This is one of the characteristics of his style. He loved scrolls and complicated ruffles and things like that. And you see that also on the chest at the top behind them, with the representation of bills of lading and all kinds of tax documents that have lead seals on them. So that's what those dark gray discs are. They're lead seals that would sort of seal if it was a legal document. And then the older person, who I still can't figure out whether it's a man or a woman, is entering information into a ledger. And they both look very grasping. And I think part of that is because Ramesvale paints their hands and their fingers with all these veins and everything that really give this sense of the graspingness of these individuals. Now, I do want to mention that at this time, Jews were often invited to the courts of Europe to act as moneylenders, because you may be familiar with the fact that Christians were not allowed to lend money at interest. This put Christians at a real disadvantage, especially the very wealthy, who had to make loans to pay for projects, sometimes building projects, military projects, building churches and cathedrals and so forth. So groups of Jews would be invited in as servants and under the protection of the courts of Europe, but they were always very vulnerable. And one of the reasons why was because they were allowed to lend money at interest, but also the interest rates they charge could be carefully regulated by the Christian courts so that they couldn't give exorbitant interest rates, where Christian illegal money lenders would do that. So it was a kind of check and balance. But whenever the courts felt they had enough of the Jews, they could just say, well, you're not being protected by us anymore. And they were hated for this role because they would be calling back loans from people. And rather than pay the loans, Christians would often massacre the Jewish populations, or they would say, get out. So Jews were constantly being thrown out. Yes?
This painting, I wonder if the fellow who read is actually looking so strange because he's paying his taxes and doesn't want to.
That could be. That could be. He could be paying the taxes. But a lot of times, the oldest images of this type of image go back to pictures of husbands and wives who were like counting out and entering amounts in ledgers. So I was just assuming he's a younger apprentice or assistant to the older person. But it could be that he's paying his taxes. That could be true. Sorry?
The older man is impassive, you know.
Well, he's not impassive. He's busy entering.
He's not grimacing, you know.
No, he's busy copying down, the accounts. He's like an accountant. Anyway, so moving on, because I do have a lot of stuff to cover, and I don't want to keep stopping for comments because we'll never get through all of it. Anyway, so this is a painting by an artist that many of you probably are familiar with, Hieronymus Bosch, another Netherlandish painter. It's called Death and the Miser. And it actually shows two episodes in the story of the miser, and it keys into the previous image. So this guy is a guy, maybe he was a tax collector, but he could have been a usurer. But for sure, he was very, very involved with money. And there's all kinds of references to that. So he's alive in the foreground in a green sort of gown. Pay attention to the details, because in Flemish painting, details are everything. You see a set of keys hanging from his waist, and then there's a kind of a pocket, like a little pouch next to that, and then a rosary. So he pretends, like Uriah Heep, to be a pious, sincere Christian, but what's he looking into? His chest, right? And of course, there's a big sack of gold coins, which is being held open by a little demon, right? And then underneath the chest are all kinds of little creatures, demons, one of whom is probably holding up a promissory note. Then in the very foreground, we see armor, a helmet, a gauntlet, a shield, and a spear, and a sword, leaning against this Gothic entryway into the miser's room. And then peeking through the door is the imminence of death itself, represented typically as a skeleton. He's got an arrow that he's pointing at the miser, who's naked in bed. That's understood as his deathbed. And his soul is being actually fought over between an angel who's standing behind him with his hand on his shoulder, and a demon who's holding a sack of money and offering that to the miser, like, the saying, you can't take it with you. And then coming through a little window way up in the Gothic ceiling, is an image of Christ on the cross with a ray of light coming down at a diagonal to the face of the miser. So there's a possibility of salvation and the possibility of where he more likely will end up in hell, or maybe if he's really lucky, purgatory. And there's another demon sort of peering down through the canopy of the bed. So it's meant to be satirical, but also meant to be moralizing. And a lot of medieval and early Renaissance, especially Flemish and Netherlandish painting, has this kind of dual quality of being satirical and also moralizing. So this is another artist who is a follower of Bosch. In fact, a lot of Bruegel's early work really quotes directly from Hieronymus Bosch. Is like these, nightmarish scenes of damnation. But this is a work of his maturity, actually painted close to his death in 1565. And it was part of a series of paintings that showed the different seasons and the activities appropriate to those seasons. So this is probably around now, August, September, harvest time. And what we see in the foreground is a group of peasants who are taking like their midday break, sharing bread and milk and some other things. And then other people who are still laboring, men who are harvesting the wheat, another guy who's coming through this path in the wheat with jugs of water, women behind them binding sheaves of wheat, and then in the background behind them is some children that are shaking an apple tree to get the apples that are falling to the ground. And then as you go back, and this is a characteristic of Bruegel in general, which really makes him such a genius, you see all kinds of incidents that take us into the everyday life of people So behind that foreground tree that everybody's sort of picnicking around is a church, right? You'll see the steeple of the church. And then beyond that is a path that cuts through the wheat field, and you see some women carrying those sheaves of wheat. There's a field that's already been harvested. And then in that central area where it's green, you see a hay wain, a wagon with hay on it. And then there's a pond with children swimming in it. And then beyond that, there's a field where there's people playing on the field. And then you go even further back and you see a sea or the ocean with a harbor and a village, and there are boats on that. So there's this kind of sense of simultaneity in Bruegel, which is really what he does so brilliantly. He orchestrates so many different events going on at the same time. And you can even say that sometimes, maybe not in this case, but sometimes he'll place like a biblical story in the midst of all this other stuff. And suddenly we realize, oh, that's Christ carrying the cross to Golgotha, you know, something very significant. Or that's Icarus falling from the sky into the ocean. You know, Auden wrote a very famous poem about it. I think I read it the first time in your class, in fact, in Brooklyn College. Anyway, so yeah, it's called Musée des Beaux-Arts. It's a great poem, inspired by this famous painting by Bruegel of Icarus. So there's a sense of all these things happening all at once in Bruegel's painting. And I would urge you to go to the Met. I'm going to show you a few paintings that are in the Met's collection this evening, but this is one of them. It's a really captivating, wonderful painting to see in reality. And the Met also owns this extraordinarily rare block, wood block, which Bruegel drew a scene on and started to carve and never finished it. So one of the ways in which paintings were popularized was from prints. And usually artists did not carve their own blocks. But we're pretty sure that Bruegel actually carved this block to make it into a wood engraving, but he never finished it. And it's dated 1566, so it's just 3 years before he died. So the Met has this in its collection, but it's rarely put on display because it's very fragile. It's black, brown ink on apple wood. And he would have engraved it with a very fine engraving tool that makes like a very thin V gouge into the wood. And when you put ink on that, the ink would stick to the surface and make an image. That was like early printing way of making reproductions. And the scene here is the wedding of Mopsus and Nysa, or the Dirty Bride, which was a play that came from the Greeks that was usually performed during Shrovetide, which is the period just before Lent, the period of Carnival, when people were allowed to be really wild. And there were a lot of street festivals and masquerades. Men would sometimes dress as women, women would sometimes dress as men. And that was the only time when you were allowed to do those things. So it was a period of all this kind of merriment and street theater. There was a lot of street theater. So thinking about that idea of, you know, behaving in ways that are kind of generally not acceptable. This is another painting that's in the Met's collection by a Venetian artist named Lorenzo Lotto. And it's, the title of the Met gives it is Venus and Cupid. But what's going on here? What's like, what would you say is kind of socially unacceptable behavior, even today? What do you see that's a little off color here? You can say it. Yeah?
It suggests incest.
Okay, it suggests incest. Oh, incense. There is incense in there too, but incest. Yeah, because we know that Venus was the mother of Cupid. But what's Cupid doing?
Peeing on her.
He's peeing, and where's his pee landing? On his mother's vulva, really, on her lap, right? Right into her lap, right? So, okay, so we wonder like, well, that's kind of surprising and kind of goofy. Look at her expression and stuff. And even the Cupid is a little goofy. So he's peeing through what could be either a myrtle wreath or a bay leaf, both of which have symbolic significance. And dangling from that wreath is an incense burner. And then she's laying on the grass on this blue cloth. And she's got this band around her, just under her breast. So that is a tradition that goes back to the marriage ceremony in ancient Rome, not something that Renaissance Italians would practice. So it's referencing that. She's also wearing like a tiara or a diadem, which is encrusted with gems and pearls. And she's also wearing one dangling earring with what's called nowadays a Baroque pearl. Where do pearls come from?
Oysters.
Oysters. So they come from the sea. And we know that Venus was supposed to have been born fully formed as a beautiful woman from the sea. And so the pearls are connected to her, her history. And then, of course, above her head is a conch shell. And that, again, is a reference to the sea. Conch shells were also used as trumpets. And it may have also been a reference to like calling together people, because this is believed to be a visual epithalamium. And I know Joan will know what an epithalamium is, right?
Yes.
What is it?
Oh, well, it's something that celebrates a marriage. It can be a poem.
Right. Okay, so typically it's a marriage poem. So we believe that this was commissioned from Lotto as a marriage image. And we know that also the Italians, when they got married and women brought their trousseau to their groom, their husbands, they would have these big chests, which were called cassone. And inside the lids of cassone, very often, I'm not saying that this was that, but inside the lids of cassone were usually either illustrated marriage manuals, which showed these supposedly virgins how to do it, or sometimes very graphic erotic images inside the lid, which was private, so only they were supposed to see them. And then, they might be carved or painted on the outside with other kinds of seams. So this is a painting done in oil on canvas, so it's always meant to be hung, but it was probably commissioned by a fairly erudite, wealthy person, and they gave Lotto, as would be the case with most of this kind of stuff, a program that he had to follow. So it's believed that it represents the auguring of the bride, who is seen as Venus, and she's strewn with rose petals, which to this day, if you go to some weddings, you'll see little girls, with a basket throwing rose petals on the aisle for the bride. And then the tree trunk behind her has ivy clinging to it, and that's an old symbol of marital fidelity. And then the image of Cupid, who, by the way, if you notice very carefully, you notice he has a quiver, right? Because he's supposed to shoot arrows, and that's what makes people love each other. The quiver is very phallic looking. It's a sort of lilac-y pink. If you look just behind him, between the wreath and his body, you'll see that. It sort of looks like an uncircumcised penis to me. Okay, it could be vaginal too, but it's long. It's a long, narrow thing. It's a quiver. Oh, the opening of the yeah, that's vaginal too. So, and he's peeing on her lap, which again is sort of augur for fertility. And I guess implicit in that is that she'll have some male, children to have heirs. There's also one little warning in it, and that is the snake that's coming out of the grass. It's literally a snake in the grass. And that might have been a reference to the story of Lucretia, which is an ancient woman who is married to, I think, a general or prince who was raped by a general. And because she was disgraced, she killed herself. Sometimes she's represented stabbing herself, and sometimes she's bitten by a poisonous snake. And that was considered like appropriate. If a woman was raped and she was married, she was ruined. So the right thing to do is to just end it all, because somehow she was responsible for that act. Anyway, we're moving on to some Dutch paintings here from the 17th century. And I don't think most of us think about that as particularly funny, but actually they were. They were very jolly guys and women. And of course, we all associate, or we should associate beer with Holland and the Netherlands, because beer was like the staple drink of people. People generally didn't just drink water. So either beer or wine, and more likely beer, because Holland was full of breweries. And still is, that's right. Germany, you travel around Europe, you'll find breweries all over the place. Now too here, with all those microbreweries. So anyway, not to talk too much about beer, but so Rembrandt, who's an artist I think probably everybody here is familiar with, made many portraits, many biblical scenes and so forth. And this is his version of a mythological scene. And if you don't know the story, I'll tell you it in a real nutshell. Zeus, who is the king of the gods, looked down from Mount Olympus, and he had this like infinite vision, and he saw this what is often referred to as a comely youth, a young boy who really, was so beautiful that Zeus just decided he had to have him. So he transformed himself into an eagle, and he came down and he swooped down and he abducted Ganymede, made him immortal, and made him his cupbearer. So if you see images in Olympus of Zeus on his throne, you'll often see a pretty young boy holding a wine goblet. That's Ganymede. But in Rembrandt's version, Ganymede is this kind of puling, chubby baby who, again, if you look very carefully, you'll see that he's so scared that he's doing what a baby would do, which is he's peeing, because he's frightened to death of this eagle that's descended upon him from the sky. And, Rembrandt paints this kind of cloudy, stormy sky. Of course, another symbol of Zeus was the thunderbolt. So Rembrandt's version of this is not the kind of ideal, Greek myth. It's more a real, very down-to-earth story of this baby. And I wouldn't say it's a particularly beautiful baby, not a Gerber baby at all. But anyway, that's Rembrandt's sense of humor, I think. And then the painting opposite of it by Peter de Grebber, who's a less known Dutch artist, shows a topic that was popular in Netherlandish painting going back to the very early Renaissance, which is called the unequal lovers or the mismatched pair. Usually it features a much older man and a younger woman who's either propositioning her or in a very unfortunate arranged marriage. And you could see that usually the woman is miserable and the man is like sort of ogling at her or something like that. But in this painting, he reverses the age difference, where he has an older woman who's grabbing a much younger man. But in this case, there's an ambiguity because we don't really know what the nature of their relationship is. Does she have the hots for this young buck, or did he ingratiate himself with her so that he could get her stuff? Because you notice that he seems to be carrying away a chest that has this bright red, expensive cloth hanging out of it and other sacks and things. So he might be a thief who's tried to seduce this older woman to get her stuff away from her. So there's that kind of interesting ambiguity, and really interesting the way the artist painted it, because they're kind of isolated against this blank light background, which is fairly untypical for Dutch 17th century paintings. And the struggle turns into this really kind of interesting abstract silhouette against that black background. So it's a very unusual painting. I happened to see it when I was visiting the Low Art Museum in Miami. I said, oh, this is really an interesting painting. Plus, I'm married to a much older wife, so it's a kind of personal interest for me. But anyway, well, we don't have that kind of relationship, though. We have a great relationship. Last but not least is another painter that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Johannes Vermeer, whose work usually is very quiet and subdued and sort of introspective. But in this one painting, which is fairly exceptional, and apparently a lot of critics did not like this painting because of it, the young woman is looking directly at the viewer, and she seems to be perfectly content, even delighted at the attentions of this man who is offering her a beautiful stem goblet of white wine and sort of saying, drink up, dearie, you know, come on. And she may even be a little tipsy already. So, you know, drunkenness was the theme of a lot of Dutch 17th century paintings, and drunkenness would lead to illicit relationships, you know, to uncontrolled behavior. So that's going on in the foreground. And I would say that her dress is really expensive. That is not a cheap dress. That's made from imported from China silk, probably an expensive dye, that vibrant coral color. There's gold threads in her sleeves, lace. So all of this was very luxurious and very expensive. But it also looks like she may be in a tavern, or perhaps maybe even a very high-class bordello. In the background is another man who's sort of self-involved, and there's a beautiful white ewer or pitcher on the table with imported citrus from Spain. And then behind him is a painting of a very formal-looking portrait of a Dutchman in, you know, one of these big lace collars and, you know, elegant clothing, but in the shadows, so it's sort of quietly there in the background. And the other little giveaway in the painting is the open stained glass window, which incorporates an image of Prudencia, which is the personification of prudence as a woman. So there, very pointedly, Vermeer is saying something about what's going on in the foreground, and is the girl being prudent or imprudent here? You know, probably imprudent, right? So again, it's got this kind of sense of humor, but also a kind of moralizing message. And I actually prepared a little audio demonstration here, which I can cue up really quickly on my iPhone. So it won't be very loud, but you'll get I'll hold it up to the microphone. So this guy is playing a street instrument, which was called a rummelpot. And what the rummelpot is a ceramic jar, which has a hollow middle with no bottom, and stretched over the top of it is a pig's bladder, which makes like a drum, but attached to the center of it is a stick. And when you rub that stick with a wet piece of fabric, it makes a very, very funny noise. And I have it. You hear it? So that's a rummelpot, and she's rubbing that stick. So you get the idea, right? So that's the noise that this guy is making. He would be a street musician who would be going around making that silly noise. By the way, in Latin music, you know Latin music, there's an instrument called the cuica. That's the same instrument, except it's played from the back, but it's the same instrument. So the rubbing makes the stick vibrate, and then the bladder stretched on it is like a resonator. So you hear that sound. And you can imagine this guy, homeless or, you know, like a beggar, walking around the streets, playing this cheap instrument, could be easily made, making this really annoying noise with it, and the kids loving it. Also, because of the gesture you have to make of stroking the stick, it has an obscene association with it, which everybody would know. So there's that too. Well, maybe the little kids didn't know it, but the boy behind him who's making that gesture with his tongue definitely knows that meaning. And by the way, he has this raccoon tail on the back of his hat, which meant that he was a fool. So you can see a door is ajar and two adults are also looking out, and the kids are giving him money. They're giving him coins. So that's what's going on in this painting. And again, the Rummel pot would be used a lot during the Shrovetide festival because it made this kind of rude noise. It sort of sounds a little bit like a fart or a belch. And then another character, stock character in Dutch Shrovetide plays, was a character called Pickle Herring, which is very similar to the English, pickled herring. So this character was always eating pickled herring, which had to be soaked in brine, so it was very salty. Therefore, he had this infinite thirst for beer. So there he is presenting his empty beer stein, and you can see he's already a little inebriated, and that's his outfit, this red and yellow outfit that Pickle Herring would wear, sort of like a clown's outfit, and people would know that character, and he was a comic type of character. The other thing I want to point out in this particular painting by Hals, they're both by the same artist, is that the model appears in other paintings by Hals, and he clearly was a mixed race guy. So, what used to be called a mulatto. So a guy who probably came somehow, his ancestry could be traced back to the slave trade and bringing slaves from Africa into Europe. So two more Dutch 17th century artists who were involved with humorous imagery, usually having to do with music and drunkenness. Judith Leister painted this self-portrait around 1630. And what's interesting about that is not only does she represent herself as a very distinguished artist, because she's not dressed the way she would if she was working in her studio. You'd be crazy to wear that expensive, there was I think it was called a grindstone collar, or millstone collar, because if she leans forward, she's gonna get the lace in the wet paint on her painting. So that's kind of funny, but I think that the humor here was in the jovialness of herself, dressed in her best outfit, holding her palette, holding all these brushes and a rag, holding a brush in her hand, and working on a painting, which is a kind of stock theme of a fiddler, which again, you could see he's smiling. It's on her easel. And we think that perhaps this very painting was submitted as her reception piece to the Guild of St. Luke, because we know that she was one of the few women accepted into the Guild of St. Luke, which was the guild for artists. So apparently in the Dutch Republic, women were accepted into guilds, where in many other countries, women were not allowed to be guild members. There are records of other women in the Guild of St. Luke in Harlem.
Would that have to do with the Protestant population?
It could be, and also the government was a more democratic, so it was a republic. So there was like people were, the people were governing themselves, even though there was certainly a hierarchy, and there were slaves, and there were people who were not allowed to vote, like women.
Yeah, Dutch West Indies would account probably for the mulatto.
Possibly also, sure, yeah. So yeah, because the Dutch had colonies in Africa and Suriname and Asia and so forth. So, so this painting though might have been her reception piece into the guild, which were called masterpieces, which is where we got that word masterpiece from. And then the other painting by Judith Leister is of the same theme as Hals's painting of a merry toper, possibly Pickle Herring. And she shows them again with the empty tankard. And on the table, you'll notice, is tobacco and a pipe and a brazier. So tobacco was another thing that was imported to Holland, which was extraordinarily, and men and women both smoked these clay pipes. They were very popular. You'd smoke from it and then break a piece off and, the long, long stems of these pipes, and you can see it on the table. And this same model appears in other paintings by Judith Leister. I also want to mention that Leister's father was a brewery owner, and his logo was Lay Star, which had little stars in it that for the brewery that he owned. And we know that Judith Leister, who is younger than Hals, was a rival of Hals because there was a court case. She sued Hals over an apprentice that left her workshop to work in Hals's workshop. And the other artist is a Flemish painter who worked in Flanders, Adrian Brouwer, who often painted drunken brawls, barroom scenes, guys getting out of control, this guy making a face, with a handy little pocket knife so he can cut his meat or his pickled herring. He's drinking wine from a glass and a pitcher, and the other guy who's drinking something that obviously doesn't agree with him because cheap beer was very bitter, and the painting is called The Bitter Draft. So he's just drunk something that's probably not very tasty. And of course, that would be funny. So now I'm going to Japan, and I'm showing some dance masks and no masks, and an ancient mask from Bugaku, which is a very ancient form of masked performance and dance from Japan. So the oldest mask is the one on the left, which is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which has one of the great Asian collections really in the world, because they started collecting Asian art before a lot of other American museums did. So there's this really beautifully carved wooden mask that was probably originally painted with lacquer, and it shows a character. I don't know much about the character, Kotokuraku Hei Shitori type. I don't really know what that really means, but it's a comical character because he's sticking his tongue out. And a serious character would never do that. But I do want to know a little bit about the character Hyotoko, who's the image of the other three masks and the masquerader in the foreground of the street festival is wearing a Hyotoko mask. Hyotoko was the Shinto god of fire, and he's always shown with Google eyes and a puckered lips like this because he's understood to be blowing through a reed to make the fire intensify, right? So that's it, like a bellows or something like that. To blow the fire, when you start a campfire, you'd blow on it or fan on it to get the fire to grow. So that's what's being shown here. But he's meant to be a comical character. And you see in a modern photograph of a parader who's wearing a Hyotoko mask and other comic figures behind him. And there's a lot of comical figures that wear these specific masks that represent a comic figure, and then serious figures too. And they also figure in like bunraku, puppetry and stuff like that in traditional Japanese theater. So now we're going back to Europe. In Austria, in the Austrian Empire, Franz Xavier Messerschmidt was an interesting guy because he had a very successful career as a sculptor. He reached a level of getting royal commissions. So he was making portraits of the king and queen of the Austrian Empire. But then he had this great collapse because apparently he was expecting to get like the chair, what we would call the chair of the sculpture department in the Royal Academy. And some other sculptor who was a mediocre sculptor got that, because these are never meritocracies, right? So he really was crushed by this. And he left Vienna and moved back eventually with his brother, who was also an artist, and then to a house in a small town near Bratislava called Pressborough. And there he worked in isolation or relative isolation. It was thought that he might have had a nervous breakdown. And for a time, he sought treatment with a guy named Otto Mesmer, who you might have heard of because that's where the term mesmerizing comes from. So Otto Mesmer had this kind of bizarre, rather bizarre pseudoscientific theories about treating illnesses with electromagnetic forces. And he developed a machine that people would sit around, sort of like a seance, and it would emit, like, I guess, a low-level electrical current. And somehow he thought that that was going to clean them up and fix them, a little bit like electroshock therapy, which was used later and is still used by some, medical practitioners. Anyway, so we know that he was involved with Mesmer, and some of these sculptures also include elements that he might have taken from Mesmer, because some of them have like a band over the mouth, and apparently Mesmer had a device that he would put in people's mouths with a sort of like a tape over it. And there are some images of him with those devices. But whoops, sorry. These are some of the other more extreme sculptures that he did, all based on his own face. But I don't think he was trying to make, self-portraits per se, but because that's what he looked like. That's probably a pretty accurate likeness. Though the one of him wearing this lamb's wool hat, which is the least extreme. But if you look at formal portrait sculpture, you rarely see people smiling, let alone making these very extreme expressions, because it was considered very indecorous. You just wouldn't do that. So here's one of the most distorted images, and I challenge anybody to actually try to make that face with their faces. So these are called the beaked faces. He carved these out of cheap alabaster that had a lot of flaws in it, because apparently he couldn't get access to, costly, very pure marble. Alabaster is like a softer stone that's cheaper than marble. And all of these four on top are carved from alabaster. And most of these are now in the Belvedere Museum in Vienna in Austria. But some of them are also distributed, mostly casts, in other museums. There's a lead head that the Metropolitan Museum of Art recently bought of him with his head way down on his chest, making multiple double chins. So that's the only Messerschmitt I think you can see in a public museum in New York City anyway. And these are two artists who made comical scenes in Italy. Gaspare Traversi was a Neapolitan painter who took the form and the subject matter from Baroque painting, from Caravaggio, who often made pictures of card sharps, people cheating people at cards. That was a very popular theme in Baroque painting. Georges de Latour did paintings of card sharps and cheating at cards. I mentioned Caravaggio, and a lot of other painters did this. And Traversi sort of took that, being a Neapolitan too. He would have known Caravaggio's paintings because Caravaggio worked in Napoli and left paintings behind in Napoli. And in this case, it's a scene of an old man tickling a little girl who's fallen asleep. And that would be endlessly funny. You can see the people watching are very amused. And then amusements in Venice. So, Venice was an international harbor, and people came literally from all over the world to Venice, and it was a party town. So in addition to being a great harbor with lots of international trade, it was a place where people went to have a good time, to gamble. There were thousands of prostitutes on the streets of Venice. Then there were also other entertainments like going to see exotic animals from Africa or India. So there's a rhinoceros that these people are looking at. And one man seems to be holding a rhinoceros horn in his hand and a staff. He might be the guy who's like taming the animal for the diversion of this crowd of upper class Venetians or foreigners. And you notice that all but the two serving women are wearing masks. So the tradition in Venice in the 18th century was to go around. Women wore these very elevated wooden shoes to keep their feet dry from the acqua alta in the wintertime, which still happens. In fact, it happens more in Venice now because of global warming. And they would go with these masks on so they could go around incognito to these various places, gambling places, drinking places, how's the prostitution, things like that. Yes.
Is that a mask or not the black?
The black mask, yeah, that's a little mask, a maskette. Oftentimes they wore half masks.
Yeah.
So the people wearing black are usually men, and then the woman is wearing a tricorner hat also in the center. And that looks like her actual face, but it could also be a mask. And then the young woman behind her, who's surrounded by what's probably a nanny or a chaperone, the woman wearing green. So lower class people would not be masked, but upper class people would. If you want to get a sense of this, I think I would recommend the movie Fellini's Casanova is set in Venice exactly at this time. And I know that Fellini would have looked at Longhi's paintings and gotten a lot of ideas. But that's a great, to get the flavor of that, even though it's a really wacky movie, like it's got water that's made out of plastic and all kinds of stuff. But it's really a great feeling for, you know, what Venice in the 18th century would have been like. So this is a painting by a British artist, also from the 18th century. He was one of the great satirists of British art in the 18th century, William Hogarth. And I learned from doing the research for this painting that Hogarth was instrumental in one of the first, if not the very first, copyright laws in England. It's known as the Hogarth Law, because when he was first starting out, he's starting to make wood engravings or steel engravings of his paintings, which was a way for artists to mass produce their images and offer them at, you know, low cost to people. So he produced a series of engravings from his series of paintings called The Harlot's Progress, which is about a young girl who comes from a proper family and ends up on the street as a prostitute. And it's all, you know, his work is very moralizing, but at the same time, it's a little bit like he's laughing at his own jokes and, you know, really getting a kick out of this, of the subjects that he chooses, like Gin Lane, which is all about drunkenness, and Marriage a la Mode, which is a series about, you know, a couple that marries from the wealthy, and then the husband is always gambling and going to prostitutes, and the wife is, you know, interested in other lovers, and she's also drinking, you know, so it's the falling apart of this wealthy couple. And he's talking about, you know, things that were happening in his day. So this is a more or less autobiographical painting. And this is where the cursor would come in handy if I could make it appear. Okay, so over here in the background is Hogarth himself. And he's drawing in a sketch pad or sketchbook. And we know that Hogarth did this when he traveled. So he happened to take the ferry, which was a much slower ferry, across the English Channel to Calais. This is the gate of Calais. And he's coming in here. Now I lost my cursor. I don't know why it like disappears and reappears. But anyway, I pointed out Hogarth. So he's there sketching, and if you look very carefully, on his shoulder is a hand coming from behind that building, which is one of the guardhouses to the gate. And you just see appearing behind that is a halberd, which is a kind of spear with two sort of hatchets on either side. Can you see that detail? Okay, so what happened to Hogarth was he was drawing and got arrested as a spy, an English spy. And to this day, I found out there are laws like that on the books where there are certain places you're not really supposed to photograph because it's supposed to be like fortresses. You're not supposed to, even bridges, places of like transit, you're not really supposed to photograph there. You could be technically arrested to photograph on bridges and things like that. So something like that was what was going on in Hogarth's experience. Obviously, he got out because this was done in 1748 and he lived to 1764. And I think he made it, or someone made an engraving of this. But what happened was, going back to that earlier story, another printer had an engraver make cheap knockoff copies of his series of The Harlot's Progress and started selling them on the street. And when he found this out, he went to Parliament and he said, look, we have to have a law that protects artists from this because I lose my shirt if I put out an edition of prints that people were buying and then suddenly, they're not buying those prints. And also there's a deterioration in the quality because they don't care. So that's called Hogarth's law, to not, to protect the copyright of these artists. Anyway, continuing with this image, so we see the actual gate with the drawbridge of Calais. It has royal coats of arms engraved in relief on the brick wall. And then way through that drawbridge gate, we see a ceremonial procession of Catholic priests. So remember, Hogarth is Protestant in, Church of England, England. And then in the foreground, in the shadows, is a Scotsman who doesn't look very happy. And he's got this meager meal of an onion and a piece of bread. And then on the other side in the shadows are three old market women, one of whom is a fishmonger, and she's got a skate, which is a ray fish, and then a flounder, which is a sort of silvery broad fish in the foreground, and then some other fish, which I can't recognize, maybe mackerel and stuff like that. Another one has a basket of vegetables. You can recognize the carrots sticking out and maybe some cabbages. And then in the middle ground, which is sort of the center of the scene, is this great big piece of beef that looks like beef ribs that this culinary servant is carrying. It's obviously very heavy, and this very, voracious monk who wants to devour it, who may be the person who owns that piece of beef. And then these two soldiers, these skinny soldiers who are dripping their soup, who are like really looking at that side of beef like, oh boy, I'd like to sink my teeth into that. So that apparently was imported beef from England, because the other title of this painting is Oh, the Roast Beef of Old England. And, so he's talking about, his experience in France and the business about being arrested, and then recording this incident that he might have seen at Calais, which is the harbor that you enter when you come from England. So Hogarth really kind of established a tradition of satirical images that were usually engraved for popular audiences. And in the case of Thomas Rowlandson, who is a younger popular engraver, he would also hand color these. So these are some hand colored engravings that were satirical, and you could see very obviously that there was like no holds barred in the satire, talking about defecating, diarrhea, asses, and all kinds of, which of course, in this case, you'd call a bum, because the British slang still is a bum for a tuchus. And the guy is, the central guy is having a good bowel movement, and another guy is reaching into the chamber pot. And this is all about some parliamentary issues that were very topical at the time. And Rowlandson called it loose principles. So obvious, right, pun. And then the other guy, who's a sort of a quack doctor, is administering a clister, which is a device to have an enema, right? So he'd stick the point of it into his rectum, and the rest is history. But Rowlandson was a very popular caricaturist, and he did a lot of commentary, often bawdy, about fashion, about the foibles of the upper classes. So you see a man who's trying to lace this corset of his wife, and you see this like Zaftig woman who is trying to squeeze into this corset because it was the fashion at the time. And then in the middle is bug breeders in the dog days. So that term of the dog days goes way back, I guess, to the heat of summer, and everybody is, climbing in bed together, husband and wife, and they're producing bed bugs from their sweat. And there's a little jingle underneath it, which is a little hard to read from my screen, but it says, now the weather's sultry grown, sweating late and early, better far to lay alone. Oh, we swelter rarely. And then it says, sweating here, sweating there. So that's the poem that goes along with that. So he's sort of advising not for the wife and the husband not to sleep together in the heat of the summer because they're going to be itching from the bed bugs. And then lastly is this image of, that is the elegant neoclassical spiral staircase that would take you up to the main gallery room or salon of the Royal Academy, which would have these very grand art exhibitions every year of the academicians. But what Rowlandson is saying, in the crowds to get up there, people would tumble down the staircase, and the real show was what happened when they fell, because it's called exhibition stare, S-T-A-R-E case, right? So I think they're still really pretty funny, even though, we may not know what all the references are. So this is a painting by Goya, and we all know Goya as having a kind of dark sense of humor. Towards the end of his life, when he was deaf, he painted murals on his own home, which are known as the Black paintings. And this is very close in time to those paintings. Just from around the same time, he was doing a series of satirical prints called Los Caprichos, the Caprices. Those were never actually issued in his lifetime, because then he realized that if they were available, he would probably be arrested by the Inquisition. And the Inquisition was very active in his lifetime, and he lambasted and critiqued the Inquisition in Los Caprichos. So there were very incendiary images, which he took back, and then actually they were never publicly displayed in his lifetime because they were so dangerous for the satire in them. So he's lampooned superstition, witchcraft, the upper class, and then later, of course, during the wars with Spain and the French, he did the disasters of war, which are some of them are pretty horrific. So I wouldn't call them humorous at all, but he was talking about the foibles of humanity, And the first etching in the suite of etchings of Los Caprichos is "The sleep of reason produces monsters." And it shows a young man who's fallen asleep at his writing desk. And you see these goblins and things appearing to him. So Spain was really behind Europe in the Enlightenment. And this was really very much what Goya was about, introducing the Enlightenment to Spain, hoping that Spain would become a more enlightened place. And eventually, he sort of fell on the bad side with the new King Ferdinand when the monarchy was restored after the French invasion, and he ended up spending the last few years of his life in Bordeaux, in France, in exile. So this painting was done shortly before he left Spain. And again, it's a Shrovetide scene. It represents a kind of carnival, street festival just before Lent, where women are in masks and men are wearing costumes and they're sort of dancing around in the street. And there's this banner. We know originally he did a sketch for this, which has survived, which shows this grimacing face on the banner, but it also says muerte, which means death. You know, so there's always like, yeah, it's funny, but it's also not so funny. Okay, I got to speed myself up here because we're still in the 18th century, but here are some self-portraits by French artist de Creux, and artists often made fun of their own faces. So another artist, a slightly later artist from the 19th century, Louis Leopold Boilly, who made lots of satirical images, portraits of friends that were satirical, self-portraits. These two drawings are self-portraits. And then he also specialized in trompe-l'oeil, which were fool-the-eye paintings. And this is a combination. So it's kind of a funny portrait, probably not a self-portrait, because this guy has a dimple in his chin, and he doesn't look anything like Boilly. And these are definitely Boilly. We know that those are self-portraits. But his head is, poking through a canvas, like a ripped canvas. And it's so convincing that it looks like, this head is really poking through a canvas. That's what trompe-l'oeil is all about, of convincing us that, we're seeing something that's real, that's painting. Really, the great caricaturist of the 19th century was Honoré Daumier. Daumier was a great cartoonist and caricaturist, often directing, like previous images we saw, at politics. This was a series of 36 unfired clay painted portraits of identifiable members of the French Parliament. So he could have gotten in a lot of trouble for this. They were unique, but later on they were cast in plaster, and then editions were posthumously cast in bronze, which is what we see in American museums and some European museums. But the Musée d'Orsay in Paris has the original hand-painted with oil paint by Daumier, and that's what these are from. I should add that Daumier was actually arrested, not for this, but for other political cartoons that he made that were published in the liberal press. And there were censorship laws. So he made a caricature of Louis Philippe Napoleon, the new king in the Restoration monarchy. He represented him as a pear, which was a double entendre with fool. So that was pretty risky too. Okay, so we're back to Japanese art. These are woodblock prints that made a big sensation in Europe in the late 19th century. But this is a subgenre of the ukiyo-e prints, which are these prints of the floating world. Again, I'm bringing back that idea of animals acting as people. But the animal that figures in two of these is a sort of a mythical animal. He is called a tanaku, which apparently in Japan was this animal that brought good luck, but it was a prankster animal that was sort of half raccoon, half dog. But here he has the body, at least in the one by Utagawa Kuniyoshi, of a human. And he had the particular characteristic of having a huge scrotum, which could be transformed in different forms as a useful item. And in the Kuniyoshi series, it's called the all-purpose testicle series. It's really not the testicles so much as the scrotum, or popularly known as the ball sack. You probably never thought you'd hear this in the library, but in the series, and you can look them up, they are online. He transformed his scrotum into an umbrella, into a raincoat, into a fishing net. He would team up with other tanaku, and they would catch fish in it, and all kinds of imaginative things you can do with your huge scrotum. And in the case of the image here, he's transformed it into what's called, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, rokubi, which is a long-necked monster, which is usually featured in Japanese ghost stories, is a ghost that can elongate its neck and project its head way out to scare people. So that's what he's doing. You can see where that thing is coming from. It's coming all the way from his crotch and coming out, and it's got these goggle eyes to look like a goblin that's scaring these other two animal human creatures that are running away. And then in the other one by Yoshitoshi, it's called Tanaku of Hiru Plain. So that's the Tanaku. There are two of them carrying umbrellas. Some of them are carrying Japanese traditional umbrellas, but some of them are also carrying Western umbrellas. So that shows a Western influence. And I don't know what the whole story is. Unfortunately, I can't read Japanese, but the human is kicking the scrotum of the foreground Tanaku, who's probably doing something. And this is also part of the series, because a lot of times these, like the Harlot's Progress, these would be printed in editions that had many images that were connected to them. So this was connected to famous humorous places in Tokyo. And last but not least, by one of the greatest of the Japanese printmakers, Utagawa Hiroshige, is cats crossing to eat. And that's representing acrobats, street acrobats, who normally would do this thing of, there would be like a team of acrobats, and one of them would balance himself on a pole, a thin bamboo pole, but since these are cat acrobats, which again is that trope of comedy of transforming cats into people, the acrobat who's balancing himself is balancing himself on sticks of dried tuna, which was a popular, inexpensive, food that you can buy. I'm sure they still make it. It's called katsuo bushi. That's dried bonito tuna. And of course, cats love fish, right? So it's sort of like making them have human characteristics as acrobats, but also sort of paying, homage to cats' predilections. So now we're sort of getting into the 20th century with this ceramic self-portrait by Robert Arneson, who made many self-portraits, even images of him when he knew he was dying of brain cancer. He did some self-portraits that had to do with that. But a lot of them are very, very funny. And this one I also happened to see at the Lowe Art Museum in the University of Miami, which is one of my favorite, of him pressed against a plate glass window. And you could see his nose has been depressed and his lips. And I thought it was just a great juxtaposition with this really great Klingit war helmet mask that I saw in the Museum of Natural History recently. And by the way, I went there because the Museum of Natural History recently has renovated, finally, the Northwest Coast galleries. So there's much better light. It's still really dark, but there's updated signage and better lighting. And this wonderful piece of wood sculpture is displayed there. And it's just, I don't know exactly how it's supposed to function. I mean, these were worn as helmets, but I doubt that it was ever actually worn in a battle. It's probably more ceremonial. So work by two contemporary artists of the late 19th century, James Ensor, a Belgian artist. Ensor was an amateur musician himself. He played the harmonium. His harmonium is still in the James Ensor House Museum in Ostend, where he lived in the coastal town in Ostend. And he made a lot of satirical imagery. This one is called The Frightful Musicians. And again, he has animals as people, and you can imagine the horrible sounds that they're making with their instruments. And then Toulouse-Lautrec, who was a really great graphic artist. And one of the things I'm sure you know is that he made posters for the Moulin Rouge and for Aristide Bruant and various performers. These performers, like Yvette Gilbert, who was a famous cabaret singer at the Moulin Rouge, was also a friend of Lautrec's. They usually sang songs with double entendres, really bawdy double entendre songs. Like Bessie Smith sang a song called My Kitchen Man, which is, I love the way he stuffs my chops, his jelly roll is really tops. That's a pretty obvious, so around that level, but obviously in French. So Yvette Gilbert really did not particularly like the images that Lautrec made of her, but everybody could recognize her on these posters. And this is her taking a curtain call. It's not from a poster, but it was a sketch that was probably meant to be incorporated into a poster. And another artist of that period, Felix Vallotton. So Vallotton, who in his younger life was an anarchist, did a lot of these in wood cuts, very stark, simple use of black and white, brilliant use of the separation of dark and light in these, and really got a sense of contemporary life and the kind of foibles of contemporary life. So the picture that's from the Metropolitan's collection, the demonstration, represents a moment when a political demonstration was being broken up. So you can see everybody's fleeing. We can identify with that now too, right? And then the gust of wind is these, proper ladies who are coming out shopping, and suddenly a gust of wind comes, and it's so strong that it's picked up the little pug dog in the cloud of dust. And the way he suggests that is really very brilliant, like by simply cutting into the silhouette of the dog with these little kind of grooves. I know I'm running out of time and I do have more images, but this is a work taking mythology like Rembrandt and sort of bringing it down to earth. Lovis Corinth, a German artist, The Homecoming Beckons, and he based this on a painting or this engraving by one of his favorite artists, Rubens. So there's Silenus, who's the old drunken fat man in the middle. In Rubens, he's represented being helped home by a faun and a satyr, but in Corinth's painting, he's being helped home by these very attractive Maenads and some fawns in the background. And okay, so Jack Smith was an American artist who really paid a lot of attention to politics, corruption, the wealthy, and so he did many, many images that had to do with corrupt society. So this is his Gangster Funeral, which is in the collection of the Whitney, but don't hold your breath. It's probably never going to see the light of day for a long, long time, because the Whitney simply does not consider Levine's work timely. So it's not going to be on display. Even though the Whitney opened a new, much larger facility, you're not going to see this painting. It's in storage. But it's really a great satirical painting about the gangs, the mafia. And he shows this gang funeral. He had a way of sort of scintillating the surface. So there's a kind of a glitter to his paintings and breaking the forms up, somewhat influenced by Cubism. So if you can look carefully, you'll notice that the widow is in the foreground, seen from the back in sort of lost profile. Obviously, the deceased gentleman is in open casket. You see other women mourning. They're the only people who are weeping. And then these fat cats who were standing around, including a red-headed, maybe Irish, police officer in the background by the window in the funeral parlor.
Looks like it's still out of the Godfather.
Yes, it looks like it's still straight out of Godfather, sure, yeah. And then, you know, in popular culture, we had some really great artists who were doing popular comic strips. And one of the great geniuses of the comic strip was George Harriman. Harriman was from New Orleans originally, and he was mixed race, but he passed as white. And it's said that he always wore a fedora because he didn't want people to notice his kinky hair. But he was light enough to pass for white, and he had a very good career as a cartoonist, syndicated cartoonist. He was one of the first cartoonists whose work was made into animated cartoons, but the ones that were on TV were not those. Those were made posthumously much later. I used to watch them when I was a little boy. So the cast of characters of his most popular comic strip was Crazy Cat. So in the middle is Crazy, and then Officer Pup, who is always a dog. It was an eternal love triangle, and then Ignatz Mouse, who was on top of his hat with a brick. So the story always was that Ignatz threw a brick at Crazy, and Crazy thought that was his way of showing his love for her. And Officer Pup was always chasing Ignatz and always putting him in jail for throwing a brick at Crazy Cat. So it's like this constant, you know, story. And then there was a kind of a witness character who was played by this weird looking bird. Another popular genius comic strip artist was Rube Goldberg, and his name has become synonymous with wacky contraptions. So this is a self-portrait in the upper left. Apparently he hosted a CBS radio program, and that's some kind of wacky robot that he concocted in his imagination. But you can also see a typical Rube Goldberg comic image, which always starts with a simple way to, right? A simple way to tie your shoelace, a simple way to boil an egg or something like that. And it always ends up being very complicated and these weird devices that he makes. And what makes them so funny is he treats them like a patent office's diagram. Point A is this, which works with point B, which activates C, and so forth and so on. So this I thought was great because nowadays we simply, you know, have these selfies that we take with, you know, our cell phones. And here's the predecessor to the selfie cell phone, which is this complicated device that he works out finally that pulls the trigger of this old-fashioned bellows camera. So a more recent cartoonist who's one of the geniuses of underground comics is Robert Crumb. This is 1989 self-portrait. He's made many self-portraits, but I really love this one. And I noticed in below his signature, it says R. Crumb 89, he's crossed something out, and I'm pretty sure it says his favorite. So this was one of his personal favorite self-portraits. And I love that he's just standing there in his crumply clothing saying, so. And then he teamed up with a Long Island-based comic book artist, Eileen Kaminsky, and they're married. They've been married for many years now, and they often collaborate. So in this one, this is from 2015, it's a comment on the Charlie Hebdo cartoon, which appeared in Holland, where it ended up the cartoonist was murdered for it. And Aileen is saying, oh my God, your comic is worse than Charlie Hebdo. I'm saying it in her voice. They're gonna come after us. Hey, I wanna live to see my grandchildren grow up. They do have grandchildren, by the way. And, you know, typical of Bob Crumb, he says, come on, it's not that bad. Anyway, they probably killed enough cartoonists. Maybe they got it out of their system. So he has this very kind of light, you know, response to that. Anyway, going to the 60s, you know, one of the things that had happened in the art world was that art got so serious and humorless and sort of esoteric that artists themselves started to revolt against that by producing what came to be known as pop art. And two artists who were sort of involved with that, although I don't think Keynotes was ever really called a pop artist, he's called an assemblage artist, but he worked in California, was, you know, this kind of very funky response to the high seriousness of art by reintroducing contemporary reality. So Keynotes' response to that is to actually go to junkyards and reassemble the front end of an old Dodge, which was a cheap car to begin with, and then present this kind of scene, what goes on, let's say, when two horny teenagers get a jalopy, that's what they were called, a jalopy, and you can actually see what's going on inside the car. And there's also real beer bottles which have been thrown out on AstroTurf to create, you know, like a grassy field. And then Oldenburg, who was an emigre from Sweden, based in New York for many years, worked with his wife, then wife Pat, to create these giant sewn stuffed pieces of food, frankfurters, hamburgers. So imagine the first time someone walked into a gallery and saw a giant hamburger plopped on the floor like this, or these cheaply made paper mache enamel painted relief sculptures of 7-Up and Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola and ads for stockings and stuff like that, right? So really bringing art back down to earth and also to consumer culture. Because that was part of an installation that Oldenburg did called The Store. We actually rented a store somewhere, I think, on the Lower East Side, and opened it up to.
Because the bill was there.
Oh, Bill saw it, right? Yeah, in the 60s, early 60s. So a little bit after that, Red Groom started producing with his wife, Mimi Gross, who was the daughter of Chaim Gross, who had a studio in this neighborhood. There's a sculpture on Bleecker in that little park by Chaim Gross. And yeah, very close to here. And they started producing what they called sculptopictoramas, which were these walk-in environments representing real places, but in this very, very funky way. So he called all these, they call these installations Ruckus. Ruckus Rodeo, Ruckus Manhattan. The first one was Ruckus Chicago. And I went to this one, so I remember it very vividly. In 1975, on an 88 Pine Street, which was an unfinished office building, in the lobby, you went in here and you crossed over a little gangplank from the Staten Island ferry, which is there. The ferry was on springs, so when you walked on it, it rocked like the ferry. You saw the Statue of Liberty, which you can just see the base of there in the foreground. And then you went to, you walked into Lower Manhattan. Wall Street was there, the Stock Exchange, the Twin Towers, which you can actually climb up in, you know, and all kinds of, and of course the subway with all the graffiti, because that was the height, that was during the Beam administration when New York almost defaulted, and there was graffiti all over everything, right? So in his version of the subway, there's graffiti, and also all kinds of characters that you would bump into, ladies with shopping bags, crying children, scary men who are causing the children to cry, you know, all kind of, man falls asleep. You might have had that situation on a crowded, you know, bus or subway where someone starts falling asleep on your shoulder and into your lap. And by the way, also, when you got on the subway car, which was almost life size, it was also on springs. So you felt like you were rocking, you know, in the old subway cars that were very noisy. And I don't remember if there was also a soundtrack where you piped in the sound of the squeaking, you know, subway cars. But anyway, this is from a series of works that Philip Guston did, focusing on Tricky Dick Nixon when he had phlebitis. He did a series of cartoons about Nixon, and his head is always, yes, we recognize Nixon, but he's transformed it into a cock and balls. So, you know, genitals are always in humor. I mean, especially now, I'm watching stuff on YouTube. I can't believe what people can say. And along those lines also is not only sex, but you can use humor to address very serious issues we've seen in other images. But here in particular, there are 3 African-American artists who really use humor to address racial issues. One is a self-portrait by Barclay Hendricks called Brilliantly Endowed. And he took that title from a very positive review that was given to his work by, not Clive Barnes, Hudson Kramer, who was one of the most prominent art critics of the New York Times at that time. And he said something like, oh, you know, Barclay Hendricks' portraits show a brilliantly endowed young artist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Hendricks took that title and turned it around in this nude portrait, which has another meaning in this case. By the way, it's very hard to find a photograph of this online. I finally found this one in some obscure website, but when you go on, if you search this picture, it doesn't show up. I did find several images, but they were all blocked at a strategic place. And I was going to use another picture because I thought it was funny, because it shows 2 gallery visitors, 2 African-American gallery, a young woman and a man, and the young woman's looking at the painting like, whoa, what's going on there, you know? Anyway.
That he left his socks on.
Yeah, socks and sneakers and hat. He's a cool dude, yeah. And he painted a lot of images. He was like the first guy to really make portraits of African-American culture in the city that now many artists are doing, especially African-American artists, many of them are doing it, but he was doing it in the 60s and early 70s. He became a professor of art at University of Connecticut. Another artist, an older artist, Robert Colescott. This painting, by the way, is on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art now. And all of his works feature this kind of comic, satirical caricature, but always to a very serious end. So this one's called Knowledge of the Past is the Key to the Future, Some Afterthoughts on Discovery. And it's about the discovery of America. So you see Columbus dressed in purple with pantaloons, looking at some kind of maybe navigational scroll. In the background, you see the 2 other ships, right? The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Next to him is a skeleton which has a Viking helmet on it, which represents the earlier discovery by the Vikings. And then you see sort of what happened subsequently to that. So there's Marcus Garvey sort of appearing by an island, because Marcus Garvey was spearheading the Back to Africa movement, which is very popular during the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. But also you see the fate of Native Americans. There's a skeletal corpse wrapped in a Navajo blanket underneath the turf that's being trudged on by this African slave who's carrying probably a bundle of cotton on his back. And then Lincoln is in there. Then if you follow the rope that's connected to Columbus's ship, it reappears as a noose around the neck of a Black man who's being lynched on the other side of the painting. So it's, you know, got very serious content, but he's doing it in a kind of humorous way. And the other artist here, Betty Saar, she's sort of the mother also of a dynasty of artists, because both her daughters, Allison, and I don't know her other daughter's name, are also artists. But Betty Saar was influenced by the work of Joseph Cornell, who made these kind of surrealistic boxes, but she turned that around to address, again, racial issues by using racial stereotypes, really offensive stereotypical images like the mammy that appeared on Aunt Jemima pancake mixes, that's in the background. The knickknacks that you can get in the South, of pitch black women with thick lips carrying brooms or scrubbing or something, that kind of typical stereotype of the mammy. And in a way, use them to liberate these figures. So in one hand, you see the statuette of the mammy is holding a broom, but in the other hand, she's holding a rifle. And in front of this old chromolithograph advertisement for a soap product, which often featured mammies scrubbing clean black children who would suddenly become white or something like that. She's holding a white baby who's crying, but in front of it is a black power fist. And then on the bottom, you see pieces of cotton, which again is a reference to slavery and the harvesting of cotton. So all of this is about, what's going on in this box. So I know I'm going over time, but I want to end with a few more images, which I won't comment about, I'll just share with you. And I had to show you this because this is the work of my wife, Jenny Tango, who's done these really brilliant paintings throughout her career, using herself like Messerschmidt, but in a humorous, but also a kind of serious image. And this is the most recent one of herself at 90. This is the work of Jenny Dubnau, who's a contemporary artist based in Brooklyn. These are self-portraits also. David Campbell, who's now based in Williamsburg, Virginia. He's on the faculty of the College of William and Mary. And Nicole Eisenman, who's like a real hot right now. The Whitney shows her quite a bit, and she's in galleries and stuff like that. But I really have to say, I love this painting of the Seder, which is in the Jewish Museum. I could personally identify with it because I remember these endless Seders, which is the Passover ritual meal for those of you who are not Jewish. In the foreground is like the daddy or granddaddy would be leading the Seder. And what he's doing is he's breaking the matzah in half. And half of the piece of matzah is called the afikomen, which would be wrapped and hidden so that the younger kids at the Seder, at the end of the meal, would have a motivation to sit through the whole Gansa Megillah, which is another reference, but anyway, the whole story of the Exodus of Jews. You have to read this book called the Haggadah, which they're holding. And by the way, these are either wall bounds or Manischewitz Haggadah. So you get these for free around the holiday. You can get them from like a supermarket. And those are the Haggadahs that they're using in the painting. And, so you see the adults who are like in various levels of attention, signified also by the levels of realism. So there's like the matriarch, she looks pretty involved. One of the uncles or aunts, and the woman is, looking on with him, and he's wearing a yarmulke. That's pretty realistic, but this face and that face is not, and they're heavily textured, by the way. And you see the little girl is so impatient, she's already playing with her gefilte fish. That's what's on there. That's like a traditional, it literally means stuffed fish. It's like this conglomeration of fishes that's put together. My grandmother used to make gefilte fish. There's the Seder plate. And then this kid is bored out of his mind. She's waiting around. I don't know if she's related to him or not. It's a good question. I have no idea. And there's another, also, Nicole Eisman is a very out lesbian. And this is a kind of a kiss scene in a bar. And it's sort of like affectionate and sweet, but also a little bit comical. All her work has this comical quality to it. Last but not least, so this is the last image. This is the work of an Italian artist, Maurizio Catalan, who's sort of a bad boy because he's always getting into trouble with his sense of humor in somewhat maybe inappropriate places. Like he made a wax effigy of the previous pope that's being hit by a meteorite. So he fell down, and that was very contentious. All over Europe, Catholics were up in arms over Catalan's image of the Pope, being struck by a meteorite. And this one, I really love this one. I think sometimes he's a little obnoxious, but I have to say, this is really brilliant. So he was commissioned by the Boymans van Groningen, I don't know if I'm saying it properly in Dutch, a museum in the city of Rotterdam in Holland, to make this piece. And to do it, he actually had to have a hole cut in the floor. So I never have another view of it. That's a self-portrait. That's him climbing out of the hole in the floor. And you could see it's left raw, like someone just burst through the floor. I think that's pretty funny. And here's this guy peering up at these, what look like 19th century Dutch paintings. And then, of course, there was a problem because it was a safety issue. People could accidentally fall into the hole or kick the artwork because it's a valuable work of art. So they had to put a glass box around it, which I think makes it even funnier in a way, because now it's like enshrined in the floor is this glass box of Maurizio Catalan, peering up from the floor at the, at this work. So that is the formal conclusion of my presentation. And we've gone so much over time that I'm afraid we don't really have time for comments and questions, which I really like to encourage. But I hope you enjoyed this. I'm sorry for going over so much material, but it was so much fun that I couldn't stop. So that's my joke on you. Thank you.